Yeah, hey guys, welcome back. I thought it'd be time to get some paint on this Mini. I've had it sitting on a shelf for a fair while. Usually I'd paint something like this in sub-assemblies, but yeah, this has been sitting around already chucked together with the rider, the only sub-assembly. So I just gave it an undercoat of grey sear, just straight out of the can. The base just had some texture paint and rock stuck on it. So through the airbrush, the first paint I've hit it with is some contrast, straight contrast for the airbrush, contrast Blood Angels Red. You could do this with brush, but yeah, much smoother through the airbrush. I probably went overboard. I didn't really look at the miniature that close, and I was expecting there to be a bit more exposed muscle and the wing leather sort of stuff. So you can see here I've covered the entire Mini, and it looks quite bright, but once it dries back it dulls it down a fair bit. And after that I've used some Gore Grunter, I think it's called, Gore Grunter contrast paint, just to go in with the airbrush and re-establish some of the shadows. It's a really versatile paint, the Gore Grunter contrast. If you don't have it, I suggest you get a pot. It's really handy. Then using this cheap makeup brush, I picked these up, Kmart, Big W, whatever department store you go to, and I go around the wings. I start painting the wings first, and I'm just dry brushing ever brighter reds, basically, to establish the wing skin. I don't even know what you'd call it. There's probably a name for it. And then after I've dry brushed to where I'm happy, I'm going in with Cadian Flesh Tone, followed by Kislev Flesh, to establish some of these ridges and, I guess, striations in the skin, just to establish the look and feel, I guess, of raw meat. Maybe might be the best way to explain it. Well, that's the look I was going for. You tell me if I've achieved it or not. And after I go through those stages, I dilute 1 to 6 parts, I would say, Blood Angels Red and Contrast Medium. So it's a very, very diluted contrast paint. And I basically use that as a glaze just to bring that all back. Then I'm going to start on the bones, and I start with VX88 just to establish that base coat for the bones, to try and nullify any of the red popping through the pale bone colours that I use, which after I wash with Agrax, I start coating all the bones with Ushabti Bone, followed by Screaming Skull. And usually I could stop there, but I wanted a very stark white. I wanted it to contrast a lot more with the red of the wings. So I then used Pallid Witch Flesh as a final highlight, just to bring out a stark white in the exposed bone. So this is the start of the Pallid Witch Flesh, and it's a real simple highlight on these bones. I don't know if you call it a highlight even. It's just another layer, just right on top of when the Mini's on the table. That the level of bone that's pointing straight up that you see is what I tried to have the Pallid Witch Flesh on. Then, just for some visual interest, I decided to do all the claws, horns, that sort of stuff black, as well as black skin that's whatever's left hanging off the frame. But I paint the skin and the claws differently. So I highlight the claws with the classic Dark Reaper, followed by Rust Grey and then Fenris Grey. Just applying ever thinning colour to whatever step I'm on. And then to differentiate even more from the skin, I make a mix of Tarragon turquoise and contrast medium, probably 1 to 4 contrast medium to the paint, and go over those claws and spikes. Then I just want to come in with a little bit more Fenris Grey and re-establish the highest point of the highlights. Now with the skin, it's covered in scales. So instead of doing a traditional line, heavy-handed edge highlight, I'm going to stipple on my highlights. And this is pretty time consuming, but there's not a lot of skin across the Mini. There's these few little scraps left on the corner of the wing, and then basically the two legs that has the scales on it. So starting with Mechanicus Standard Grey, I go about and I establish the high areas, and then from Mechanicus Standard Grey I use Celestra Grey and then Ulthuan Grey, establishing a thinner area to apply that highlight as we go. It is time consuming, but the effect was well worth it, I felt, on this Mini. So I started with the wings. Obviously they're a prominent part of the model, but it had all elements across the rest of the Mini on these areas. So I was able to work out what I was going to do and the techniques I was going to use before I moved to the larger part of the model. And that's what I did. I painted everything, worked out how I wanted to do it. The exposed muscles, I used Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh to put in the striations of that exposed muscle, and I washed that with Carlsberg Crimson, I think it's called, the red GW shade. And once I'd done the wings, I just took the techniques, those colours that I used, and went across the entire Mini. And I just used some Ulthuan Grey on the tips. around this point I thought that the bone was a bit flat, so I mixed up some Reichland Flesh Shade, drop or two of that in some contrast medium, and went through and just hit the recesses on either side of the spine and the skull, just to try and give the bone a bit more depth. I made this mini a bit difficult for myself to paint with the first step of airbrushing the Dark Angels red over everything. It was really hard for my eyes to balance and work out the colour composition as I was painting, because everything was just washed out with that bright red. So yeah, I had to cover the base as I painted at certain stages just to give my eyes a break and try and get everything a bit more balanced. So when I was comfortable and thought I was done, I went through and gave the base a pretty quick coat of Vallejo Earth Brown, I think it's called. Might be Terra Brown, I'm not sure. And when that was dry, I washed it with a Wildwood contrast paint to darken it down. The stones were painted with a neutral grey, Mechanica Standard grey or something like that, no doubt, maybe an Eschen grey. And just dry brush the stones. I didn't have a brush that would fit in to dry brush the ground, so I just ripped up a bit of foam and stippled on various creams and browns. Bonus points if you can tell me where that foam's from. The stones, yeah, just dry brushed with successive lighter and lighter browns till I was happy. And then to tie into the base, I just washed each stone, the bottom third of it, with Athonian Chemo Shade. Then just random splodges of PVA glue for some static grass. The static grass I used, I think, was steppe grass from the Army Painter, but I'm not sure. I've got a lot of pots. I just grabbed a random pot and chucked it on. On top of that, I added some flower tufts and grass tufts just to fill out the base. And at this point, I was stoked, really, to be honest, with how the dragon was looking. But it was time to paint the vampire. And I started with Black Templar contrast paint all over the armour. And I edge highlighted his armour with a very red-brown. Could have been Doom Bull or Hull Brown, I'm not real sure, but any red-brown would do. And then it was, yeah, brighter and brighter reds down to the point. By the time I got to each point, it was really bright. It looked a bit silly. I looked like he had neon Christmas lights on the point of each part of his armour. So I made up a wash of Black Templar, Blood Angels Red, and some contrast medium, and gave him a wash to tone it all down and tie it in. Now, I don't show painting every part of this mini. You can paint the cup silver. I painted it gold. You can paint it however you want. But you can see at this point just how full on those red points are. So I gave them a wash, and then I painted the skin with a mix of contrast Briar, Queen, Chill, and Nighthaunt, Gloom. And then each highlight I added more and more Pallid Witch Flesh until I was happy with how his skin was looking. The lance shaft was painted with Gore Grunter. Told you it's versatile. It's a great paint. The gold trim on his lance and stuff was painted with Retributor armor, washed with Reichland Flesh Shade, and then highlighted back up. The pointy end was painted with Leadbelcher, given a wash of Nuln Oil and highlighted, and then I used some Carisberg Crimson just for some visual interest as a wash in the recesses and the flat edges of the lance. And this is how it turned out. I hope you like it. Please like, comment and subscribe, and tell me if this is going to help you at all or what you would do differently. Thanks heaps for watching.